All right, so first of all, a very special thank you to our sponsors for today's lunch. To thank Adam Ben-Zev for dedicating the lunch and learn today in honor of Jeremy Lasser. Yasher Koach again to Jeremy for coordinating this year, for putting in all of the all of the details, all of the WhatsApp messages. And we'll say again, and it's a great supposed to be. It's 2 pages. I apologize. One page says Papers and Piety, and the other page is a picture of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So mostly with that, let us begin. So if you take a look at the topic I'd like to try to focus on a little bit this afternoon is the topic of newspapers on Shabbos. As I think it's an interesting topic in general, just about, again, there's a whole discussion in general about reading material on Shabbos, what you should read, what you shouldn't read, which I guess we'll touch on a little bit, Amir Hashem, but to be able to focus a bit on the idea specifically of newspapers on Shabbos. Let's begin with a statement from the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch writes in number 1, Shtari Hedyotos. Now, Shtari Hedyotos, we'll define that term in just a moment. Shtari Hedyotos, now a shtar is a document. Hedyot ultimately again means mundane or unconsecrated, unholy. Right? Simple. Yeah, we'll call it weekday. Shtari Hedyotos, dahainu, Shtari Chovos vecheshbonos. So the Shulchan Aruch specifically defines this as documents which have more of like a business connotation to them. So Shtari Chovos means notes of indebtedness. Cheshbonos means documents of calculations. Asr likrosam. One is not permitted to go ahead and read them on Shabbos. Va'afilu la'ayin bohem. Even to go ahead and kind of look at them below kriya without actually reading it is asr on Shabbos. So an interesting idea over here. Shulchan Aruch introduces us to this concept of what we call again shtari hedyotos. So here I just want to point out that Shulchan Aruch is defining this in a more narrow scope. And in this particular situation, again, shtari hedyotos is defined really as things which have more of a financial connotation associated with them. So to go ahead and read a document that ultimately, again, has financial connotation, even to look at a document like that, ultimately is asr. So what's the problem? In other words, remember, again, I'm not doing anything, I'm just reading a document. So what really is that? What is the issue over here? So the Mishnah Berurah says, Shtari Chovos v'cheshbonos, the Mishnah Berurah writes, Yesh omrim mishum mimtzo chafatzecha, v'yesh omrim mishum shema yimchok. So interestingly enough, the Mishnah Berurah quotes 2 opinions. We don't really have to get into the details over here because it actually doesn't matter all that much, but the idea is either because on Shabbos, one is in general not supposed to engage in the same things that one engages in over the course of the week. That's mimtzo chafatzecha. Whatever you do during the week, you're not supposed to do on Shabbos. Other possibility, interesting, is shema yimchok. And also shema yimchok is what? Lest you come to erase. So that's a concern in general when you're going ahead and looking at items related to business, a general concern that if you see something that you're unsure of, or you see something ultimately, again, that's incorrect, you may come to erase it. Either way, the bottom line is that when it comes to something that halacha l'maisa, again, is business related, one should not read it on Shabbos. Mishnah Berurah goes on, he says, Va'afilu la'ayin bohem, di'i efshar, listen to this, because at the end of the day, at the end of the day, when a person looks at these documents, it's impossible that he's not going to engage in some type of business-like thought. So we put this all together. What the Shulchan Aruch introduces us to is this concept that one is not permitted to go ahead and read Shtari Hedyotos. The idea being with Shtari Hedyotos, according to the Shulchan Aruch, things that have more of a business connotation. So on a most basic level, kind of if you had to explain what the Shulchan Aruch was referring to, Bipashtos, what is this referring to? A situation where, let's say, a person works in the finance industry, they bring home some work over Shabbos. I'm not doing the work. I'm just going to read, I'm going to read my cranes. I'm going to read, some other reports. So that's what it sounds like the Shulchan Aruch is discussing over here. Now, the Mishnah Berurah kind of broadens the conversation a little bit. And I will say, so again, and in general, the idea behind that would be, is that on Shabbos, one is really supposed to differentiate their activities in a dramatic fashion. My Shabbos activities should not look like my weekday activities, including even what it is that I read. Now the Mishnah Berurah number 3 broadens this a little bit, and he says, Ule'inyan kriyas tzaytungnin b'Shabbos. What about reading a newspaper? Could I read a newspaper on Shabbos? Af shebetshuva Shvus Yaakov mekel, even though the Shvus Yaakov, who we'll discuss in just a moment, was lenient, harbe achronim osrim, many achronim asa reading a newspaper on Shabbos, mipnei sheyesh bohem yediyah mi'inyane masa umatan. Since many newspapers have in them business information, therefore again, many posts can tell you should not go ahead and read a newspaper on Shabbos. Now, let's talk about this, because the Mishnah Berurah quoted the Shvus Yaakov, and the Shvus Yaakov says that one could be lenient to go ahead and read the newspaper on Shabbos. So what's the pshat? So take a look at number 4. So the Shvus Yaakov comments on this, and this is really quite fascinating. He says, Va'aldas kriya Zeitung b'Shabbos. Can you read a newspaper on Shabbos? Listen to this. Efshar lomar shesovrim dahad de pasek da asr likros b'sifrei milchamos hainu milchamos hakodin hayishan. Now this is very interesting. So the Shvus Yaakov says, you know, when you ask people, remember the Shvus Yaakov is Rav Yaakov Reischer, born 1607 in Prague, dies in 1733. So if you ask the Shvus Yaakov, why do people go ahead and read the newspaper primarily? To know who's fighting with who. Right? What war is happening? Who's fighting with who? So the Shvus Yaakov says something very interesting. People say, what about if in general I enjoy history? So I enjoy reading about, World War I, the Civil War, World War II. I enjoy reading about these things. So the Shvus Yaakov says, many say you're not permitted to go out and do that. Why? Hainu milchamos hakol ma'ishanim she'ein bahem tzorech likros bahem achshav. So many poskim say you're not allowed to read really just war history. Now again, this is not talking about general reading. We'll discuss that as well. But there might be dafkin in you not to read about wars on Shabbos. Right? Shabbos there's an Oneg Shabbos, Shabbos is a Yom Menucha. Maybe there's a concept ultimately not to go ahead and read about wars on Shabbos. So the Shvus Yaakov says, when we speak about not reading about wars, by definition that refers to historical wars. He says, She'im bam tzorach likros ban achshav, aba b'such ksav, haschadshos or hachadoshos, shenidbesu mikroi shal zmanim halalu, sheyesh bohem kama tzorchei b'nei adam. Says the Shvus Yaakov, but to read the newspaper so that you can know what is happening in the world. You can know, so I'll say, it sounds a little bit antithetical to us, because no one actually gets current news from a newspaper anymore. Right? It's an incredible time that we live in. The truth is, you might like to read the newspaper because the newspaper has a lot of very interesting information, but no one is looking to the newspaper for current events. It's really quite fat. We just live in a different time. But the Shvus Yaakov is saying, where did you get your current events from? Right? Where did you learn about everything from? You learned about it from, ultimately, again, the newspaper. So to know who's going ahead and fighting against who, who's at war with who, which country is at war with whom, Leida be'ez medina shul milchama, o shar mikraos raos, to know who's at war with who, what terrible things are happening, chas v'shalom, v'ulai efshar lahatzil ezel davar al yedei pu'ula ukiyotze bazeh. Now, why is it important to know who's at war with who? Because maybe that's going to impact your business interests. Now here's what's interesting, right? The impact is to know about your business. The impact may also be to know about your family. But the Shvus Yaakov says there is a very significant importance to being an informed individual. You need to know who's fighting with who, who's at war with who, in order that you could save someone or something. Nearly, deleka baze isekriya mishum shtari hedyotos. So the Shvus Yaakov says something very interesting, that when the Shulchan Aruch says that you can't read shtari hedyotos, what are shtari hedyotos? They are effectively documents. They are documents that really have no bearing on Shabbos. They have no bearing. Now again, the Shulchan Aruch defines it as things that maybe lend themselves a bit more to finance. But either way, it has nothing to do with Shabbos. Says the Shvus Yaakov, is there a Shabbos relevance or Shabbos need to reading the newspaper? So the Shvus Yaakov posits the answer may be yes. Because becoming an informed individual and knowing what's happening in the world, not just to be a worldly individual. Remember again, the Shvus Yaakov is dafka referring to the idea that I need to know what's happening in the world. Why? Because at the end of the day, there might be war happening somewhere, something going on, and therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, it's important for me to know, because it could have some type of impact on my life. Therefore, the Shvus Yaakov paskin that reading a newspaper on Shabbos would be permitted. Now, of course, when he says reading a newspaper on Shabbos is permitted, he's talking about reading a newspaper in a very defined way, which is what? Right? There's a need. It's not just time for my entertainment, it's not just time for my own edification, but rather there's some type of need that's involved. Now, if you take a look at the Magen Avram, so the Magen Avram comments over here, he says, V'chein liros, perish, afal pi she'asra liros, dioknos, kimo shakasav, miko makom, im hari'ia oneglo, mutter liros. So we'll say the Magen Avram introduces something else. Let's say, so now, what does the Shvus Yaakov tell me? Shvus Yaakov tells me I can read a newspaper on Shabbos. When? Right? If there's a need for the knowledge. Okay, so if there's a need for the knowledge, right? The Magen Avram introduces something else. What happens if I don't have a need for the knowledge, but I enjoy reading the paper? I just enjoy reading the newspaper. So the Magen Avram says that would be mutter as well. If there's just a hana, if there's just an enjoyment from reading the newspaper, again, I don't need it. In other words, if there's war, the newspaper is not. By the time you get the newspaper anyway, the war might be over, and a new war would have started as well. Right? So the Magen Avram says if there's an oneg Shabbos component in that, part of my oneg Shabbos, right? During the week I'm running around. What do I enjoy on Shabbos? I enjoy sitting down, right, with a cup of coffee. Not in the morning, because then you're going to be late for shul, right? This is not, I hear this all too often. Sorry, I was late. I was reading the paper. As if somehow that's a justifiable reason for not coming to shul on time. It is not. I want to go on record as saying that. But again, in the afternoon, you want to sit down with a drink and you want to read the newspaper. And that's part of your oneg Shabbos, because most times you don't get to do that during the week. He says the Magen Avram, that could be fine. Now, that doesn't address a side issue, which is what? Reading business-related things on Shabbos. So the Magen Avram says that you can go ahead and read the paper on Shabbos. You can go ahead and, read the front section of the newspaper that has current events. Or you could read some of the supplemental sections that have whatever is there, right? But you cannot read the business section. Reading the business section would be absolutely unequivocally problematic. That's clear. I'm sorry? Well, so there's another piece. The other piece, and the interesting discussion was the Mishnah Berurah doesn't bring this down, of Gzeras Mekach Memkar. There's a general halacha about reading anything business related on Shabbos, lest you come to engage in some type of transactional endeavors. So that does apply with reading the business section as well. So what you have over here is a progression. So you see, on one hand, you have the Shvus Yaakov, who told you pretty much you're allowed to read the paper if it's necessary for you to be informed. Right? By the way, I just want to point out this, Then you have the Magen Avram who said that if you have oneg Shabbos from it, assuming that your oneg Shabbos does not trespass on other areas of potential prohibition, you can also read the paper on Shabbos. Look at the Yavitz in number 6. So the Yavitz over here, Yavitz in his biography is on the back. Rav Yaakov Emden, born in 1697, dies in 1776. So the Yavitz writes as follows. He says, "Ule'inyan likros bekorntin hanitfasim bekrachim va'ayaros gidolos midei shavua b'shavua medina zu." Shabbos say it's amazing. It's amazing to see just how we ingest information so differently. So remember again, Yaakov Emden is talking about what? Reading the newspaper. And by the way, how often did the newspaper come out? Once a week. And it's just such a different world we live in. Probably things were much simpler, right? You got your news once a week from the weekly publication. Lohodia bikrava aretz chadashos v'koros misrak shows mi'inyanim milchama ushar ma'oros zulasis havim ba'olam yom yom. And what was the point ultimately again of this newspaper? To tell you what's happening in the world, what wars are happening, what else is going on. Nirali pashit she'inam bichlal isur shtari hedyotos. Right? So the Yavitz writes, it's not a problem. Not a problem. This is not the prohibition of shtari hedyotos that the Shulchan Aruch mentioned before. He goes on, he says, nearly pash, right? Ubiyichud zman. So again, I will say, why is that? Because remember, again, going back for just a moment, when the Shulchan Aruch prohibits the reading of shtari hedyotos, when you drill down to it, what's really the problem of Shari Hadyotos? Business. It's really a business issue. That's why you see how he defines Dahainu Shtari Chovos v'Cheshbonos. It's really a business issue and a concern ultimately again of going ahead and getting involved in business. A whole bunch of different prohibitions. But the Yavitz says, if you're dealing with a periodical that is there to give you news, is there a problem with getting news on Shabbos? Is there a problem with getting news on Shabbos, reading news on Shabbos? No issue. He says, "Ubiyichud bizman sheyesh milchama v'shaschirim ba'olam." And the Yavitz says, all the more so when there is war happening in the world, which is at any given moment, or when there are new things happening that you have to be informed about. He goes on, he says, "Shalapamim yesh tzorech gadol leida eze sad gavar." This is incredible. Because when it comes to war, it's important to know what? It's important to know what? Who won? You have to know who won. I will say, how would you know who won the war? How do you know who won the war? You read the paper. V'yesh lochush afilu machmas iski nefashos. And I will say, the Yavitz says it's very important. And it could be very important also out sakonas nefashos.
He's not talking about the obituaries.
I'm sorry, not the obituaries, right? But he said, right, yeah. Wait, who's alive? He's saying just out the idea that at the end of the day, who won the war could have an impact and ramification. Else, are you safe or not? Right? Are you safe? Are you safe in your general circumstance? Vein tzarech lomar shemistama yesh beis mechush lehefsid mamun chas v'shalom bekiruv o berichok makom v'afilu b'makom shebar hadavar she'ein magiel l'sham davar hazik bichlal shum ofen. So again, what the Yavitz says over here, and both say very much echoing the Shvus Yaakov, is that sometimes when there are dramatic events happening, you have to be informed. And you have to be informed in general because perhaps it could impact your money. Not that you're going to do anything about it on Shabbos, but after Shabbos you can do something about it. Or Chas v'Shalom, maybe it'll impact Sakonas Nefashos. You have to know what's happening, which I will say in general is an interesting idea. That, sometimes, unfortunately, you see this mindset that sometimes people think that a frum Jew doesn't have to be informed about what goes on in the world. And a frum Jew has to be exceptionally informed about what goes on in the world. In general, even if it doesn't impact me, just because I'm a citizen of the world, I have to be versed in current events. I'm sorry? Right, what are you going to worry about if you don't know what's happening in the world? Right, and a good Jew always worries about something. So there's a famous Maisa that one time Rav Kahaneman Zecher Tzadik Livracha went before he was involved with Panovich. He was the chief fundraiser for the Chafetz Chaim in Radin. So the story is told that one time he went on a fundraising trip to South Africa, to Johannesburg, and he came back. And the Chafetz Chaim said, so you would think, what's the first question the Chafetz Chaim is going to ask him? How'd you do? Right? How did you do? And I don't mean your ruchnius. Right? I meant right? But he asked something, the Chafetz Chaim asked Rav Kahneman, he said, tell me, what is the plight of the blacks in South Africa? What's the plight of the blacks in South Africa? And Rav Kahneman was incredibly so what was the plight of the blacks in South Africa? It was apartheid. It was, So Rav Kahneman says to the Chafetz Chaim, could I ask, why is the Rav asking what the plight of he said, it says something amazing. It's pretty overwhelming. He said, because if the blacks in South Africa are suffering, the Jews in Radin aren't doing enough. Now, what the Chafetz Chaim was trying to convey is that the world is the mirror of Am Yisrael, which is a pretty scary thing to think about. The world mirrors the behavior of Am Yisrael. If Am Yisrael is doing the right thing, the world looks a certain way. If Am Yisrael is not doing the right thing, the world looks a different way. If there are blacks suffering in Johannesburg, in South Africa, then the Jews of Radin need to do a cheshbon hanefesh, which really is an incredible yesod, which also tells you, almost to a certain degree, that current events sometimes give you a little bit of the litmus test of what's happening in Am Yisrael. And I will say, the truth is, you see, because with current, Rameir and I were just talking about this, right? Sometimes the worst political stuff you read in the paper, unfortunately, it used to be from this country, right? Now it's Eretz Yisrael. You hear the rhetoric, right? You hear the rhetoric, which does not belong in a Jewish country, which does not belong in a Jewish government, which does not belong, that type of banter, that type of vitriol does not belong amongst Jews. So if that's what's happening in the seat of government in the Jewish homeland, then of course it's not a surprise what's happening in the rest of the world. So the Yavitz is saying, you have to know what's happening in the world. Alts, number one, there may be sakana, maybe there's a financial threat, maybe there is a physical threat, but the truth is the Jew has to be informed because sometimes there's an incredible musar that comes when you look at what's unfolding on the international stage. He goes on, Miko Makom, Pshita, Da'adifi Kriyas Dapim Halalu, Misipure Milchamo Shita B'tila David L'bnei Adar Shemes Angem Mikach Kol Shekein Hachadi Katarti Oneg V'tzarech Karav. So this is very interesting. And the Shelis Yavit says it is much better to read the newspaper than it is to read history books about war. Right? Because some people like reading history books about war. He says, why? Because at least when you read the newspaper, there are benefits to it, right? When you read history about war, there's no real Shabbos benefit to it. You read the newspaper on Shabbos, at least you know, again, what's happening on the world scene. You know, again, if Chas v'shalom there's any sakana, who won, is there danger to your finances, is there danger to your person, and ultimately to get the state of affairs of Klal Yisrael. This is great, by the way. And somebody who reads the paper habitually, it is a tsar for them to skip a day of reading the newspaper. I will tell you, it's chatani maskir. It's not the chatani maskir. To me, meaning my day is not complete with at least going through the pages of the Wall Street Journal. It's also the only paper that a Jew should read, meaning anything else is pashat like usser, treif, and I think is like the worst waste of money possible. But again, this is not a commercial. This is just a separate aside. Right? But there's a certain element of like there's some people like their day, even if you don't get to read every article, but at least you just get to read, you know, what's happening in the world. So I don't fall into the tsar category, but the Yavit says for some people, if they can't read the paper on Shabbos, it's mamish a tsar. It's mamish a tsar. So I was saying, this is great. So understand what the Shelis Yavit is saying is, not only is it permitted als oneg, but perhaps if you read it every day and one day you don't read it, it's tsar who wants to cause tsar on Shabbos. So the Yavit says one would be permitted to go ahead. Shenafsha shokeka v'kosefes ladas hamischaj. Because some people are constantly desirous of knowing what's happening on the scene of world events. Al kain hayamira ve'inai. Therefore the Yavit says, turn the page. Heter gomer l'kuli alma. So the Yavit says, I think it's totally permitted to go ahead and read the paper. Right? Totally permitted to read the paper. He says, ultimately, good. Skip the base. I'll say this is great. So after the Yavit gives this very compelling reason to go ahead and be able to read the paper on Shabbos. For some people, it's Oneg Shabbos. But if it's not Oneg, if it's not real Oneg, at least again, you're finding out real information about serious life issues, which could be important for your finances, could be important for your personal safety. But look at it, right? It's paragraph base. Amnam. Adayin chochechani lahachmir. Oh. It was so good until this point, right? Yet the Yavit says, but I think you should be machmir, not to read the paper on Shabbos. Mitam acher, dahainu mipnei shebesofan regidim lahodia gamkein haschoros vikarkaos vikelim hanim karim. Because also he says, at the end of the day, really also newspapers serve another purpose, which is what? Which is advertising. Advertising. And in fact, again, that's how newspapers make their revenue, through advertising. And so the whole yisod, which we'll say is interesting, by the way, because, you know, using this logic, this has really seeped into a lot of the Jewish periodicals as well. I mean, you know, Villatel runs beautiful advertising in Mishpacha magazine. I read it and I say to myself, I got to get out of the Rabbanos because I want to buy a home that I could live in and rent. And right now you can still get them for under $1 million, but soon enough they're going to be above $1 million. And it's beautiful. And it has a bowling alley, and you could convert the garage into a virtual driving range. Who doesn't need a virtual driving range? And I mean, I see that to myself, and I say, I should live a third world life. So yeah. You can see Yankee after the show about it. I think how many units are left? 23. Just if you don't have to be interested. So I'll just point out. So it is very interesting to note. It is very interesting to note that Lemaisa, the Shvus Yaakov says, the real problem with reading the newspaper is that it's a mechanism for advertising, which in all seriousness, I will say, according to the logic of the Shvus Yaakov, and again, once you're getting into advertising, what are you getting into? Mekach u'memkar. Then you're getting into business. Well, once I'm getting into business, then I'm back at what? I'm back at number one, which is Shtari Hadyotos. So it's interesting. So he says the newspaper as a vehicle for news, the Shvus Yaakov, the Ayavit says, I think is totally fine. Once, however, it gets into the realm of advertising, that's where it really becomes a problem of Shtari Hedyotos. He goes on, Shari Inyane Mekach Memkar Ve'iskei Tigarim Shezevadai Asr Likroso B'Shabbos Va'afil La'ayin Bohem U'Laharher Bilva Nearly Da Asr. So again, let's say, so he writes, V'im Tomar, look at the last two lines, Yizar Me La'ayin B'Dvarm Halal Aniskarim V'Natiena B'Shar. So okay, so maybe we'll say, fine, you know what, I'm going to read the newspaper, but I'm not looking at one ad for Vilatel. I'm not looking at one ad for it. I'm not going to look at it, even though it looks good. I'm not looking at it. So you know what the Ayvit says? He says, Yesh Lomar, Schar lekarmelo, Sikre bepratos lesochrim, Shekol habatasam hu b'shokach. He says, come on, it's hard really to do that. You know, at the end, so we'll say, so what the Shvus Yaakov would essentially say is like this: to read news, he says, is not a problem on Shabbos. Not only is it not a problem on Shabbos, but if you really enjoyed it, it could be oneg, and for sure it's not asr. The problem is when you're going to get into the advertisements. That's going to be the problem, because that already becomes a much greater issue, ultimately, of mekach u'memkar. So I will say, before we get to Shir Shabbos, what you have over here is as follows. Trace the progression. You have the Shulchan Aruch telling you Shtari Hadyotos are Aser, but that's much more from a business perspective. The Mishnah Berurah seems to indicate that you should be machber, not read a newspaper, but yet the Shvus Yaakov, the Magen Avram, the Shelas Yavitz all seem to indicate that one could read a newspaper for the sake of finding out current events. And the Yavitz even goes so far to say that if you enjoy it, it might even be a form of Oneg Shabbos. But however, you cannot essentially get mired in the advertisements, because once that happens, then you get into an issue of mekach u'memkar. So what does the Shir Shabbos go? So take a look at number 7. Shir Shabbos writes, Mikra Adin, Mutter Likros HaChadoshos Bi'iton. Right? So Shir Shabbos Paskins, really, you're permitted to read the news in a newspaper. Aval Asr Likro, Va'af Lo La'ayin, Bi'inyane mekach u'memkar, HaMisparsimim Bi'iton. So again, what he says over here is, so Shlomo Zalman seems to say that halacha l'maisa, there's no problem with reading the paper on Shabbos. The problem is going to be ultimately with Inyane Mekach u'Memkar. So we'll say, it would seem to be like, let's say again you have a newspaper that let's say has a front section that's current events and a business section. Certainly you cannot go ahead and read the business section on Shabbos. And anything that has to do ultimately, again, with advertising for the sake of selling things. Like, you know, it's interesting. I don't know, I have to think about how this fits in. Like, the Wall Street Journal on Friday has a section called Mansion. Right? Great. It's incredible to see. Just like... all the earth. Yeah, all the earth, yeah. So, but Pashtos, I don't think the point of that section is to sell anything. No. Right? I don't think anybody, even you have to be like, it's not even the 1%, you'd have to be like the 0.002%. So although, interestingly enough, they do have their information about auctions. And so again, it would appear to be that maybe, aside from the auction page, you know, everything else would be mutter. So you could have information about things, but Shir Shabbos says, as long as it's not advertising something for the sake of sale, it would be permitted. Va'aflo likra ula'ayin b'ma'odo shebahen misparsamos hatzos kniya u'mechira v'hatzos avoda. Who says this? Horaz bishul. He includes, you know what else he can't read on Shabbos? You know what else he can't read? Recipes. Which, interesting, again, I know, I expected an audible sigh on that, right? You can't read recipes. Why can't you read recipes on Shabbos, right? So it's interesting, because L'maisa, again, Shlomo Zalman will say, is you're pretty much not permitted to read anything regarding something you can't engage in on Shabbos. So I can't read Shtari Hadyotos.
You're not talking sports, right?
I'm sorry?
You're not talking sports here.
Sports, I mean, again, they're yeah, I guess technically speaking, a person could engage in sports. Again,
proof that it's not age restricted.
Right. Now, I have a different issue with this in general of the fixation of adult men wearing tight pants, jumping all over each other, and other adult men being incredibly fascinated and spending money on this. To me, I think there are so many other things in the world, but that's just one man's opinion. Different share. Any event. So again, that's more a Yonei Hashkafa, different than Hilchos Shabbos. But again,
you don't read the sports section to engage in sports. It's not like reading advertisements where
right. So correct. So I think that would be the distinction. You're reading sports section to get information. Right, so I think that would fall into the same category as reading the first section, we'll call it the current events section of the newspaper. Masha'ekein, people generally read recipes, not for the sake of reading recipes. So if I'm going to read a recipe, it's because I want to make it. Or at the end of the day, if I'm going to read business section, it's because I want to be able to act on that. So Shlomo Zalman seems to be making that distinction between things you read for information versus things you read for actional purposes.
So isn't Hamadai even more problematic than Wall Street Journal? Because of all the advertising and others, I'm interested in it. The weekend Hamadiyah.
Oh, do they have? I don't know. I don't read it.
Advertising.
Yeah.
It's all interesting.
The Jewish public, even Hamadiyah, Mishpacha, it's 80% advertising.
Advertising, yeah. So,
and it's advertising targeted.
Right. I don't know unless they're assuming in some crazy way that you're not reading it on Shabbos. It goes on Friday, right? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to say. At least if Shlomo Zalman would say that you would avoid the advertising pages of it. I will say. So therefore, what comes out, halacha l'maisa, is one permitted to read a newspaper on Shabbos? Certainly, the current events section. One is permitted to read. Right? One is permitted to read. The Yavitz might even say if you read it religiously every day, it might even be a form of your oneg. Now, Bosai, you can. Should you read the newspaper on Shabbos? So again, all these things kind of become judgment calls in terms of how a person should be spending their Shabbos in general. But that's a different discussion. That's more Hashkafas Shabbos. If we're talking Hilchos Shabbos, one is permitted to go ahead and read the current events section. One cannot read the business section. Shlomo Zalman is adding in, one cannot read, I guess if a paper has a recipe section, a cooking section, one would not be permitted to read that on Shabbos, but the current events section one could read. Now, I'll end off with one last piece, because we really have to end. There is one more issue. We're talking about reading the paper on Shabbos. There's an additional issue of reading a paper which was delivered on Shabbos. Right? That's another discussion, right? So up until now, if you could imagine, like, I got the paper on Friday, or I didn't read yesterday. I didn't read Friday's Wall Street Journal. I want to read it on Shabbos. What about if the paper is delivered on Shabbos itself? So take a quick look at Shmir Shabbos number 8. See, he says Hamonoi al itun yomi. Somebody has a daily newspaper subscription. I was going to say prescription. Subscription. Shenitfas ayedei nachrim gam b'Shabbos. Imrov hakorim hakavuim al iton zeh hema Yehudim. So I will say, if you have a paper whose reader base is primarily Jewish and it's printed on Shabbos, then you can't read it on Shabbos because it makes sense because then malacha was done for a Jew on Shabbos. Let's say Shabbos fine. So this is the more shaykh case. You order a paper. I subscribe to a newspaper. The paper comes 6 days a week, 7 days a week, whatever it is. And obviously the majority of the reader base is not Jewish. Mutter likra be'iton hachadoshos hayom kudome. So you can read it on Shabbos. Why can you read it on Shabbos? It was printed on Shabbos. What's the answer? It wasn't printed for me. Or it was printed for a reader base that is primarily not Jewish. So therefore we attribute the malacha done for non-Jews, and therefore a Jew is permitted to go ahead and read a paper which is printed on Shabbos, as long as I know that the readership base is really not Jewish. The majority of the readership base is not Jewish. Now both say, but there's one more piece. Oh, good. So let's say, so good. So Yank got me. So skip down. But however, look what he writes over here. So here, the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa adds this in. He said it is better for Yarei Shamayim not to read the paper on Shabbos. In other words, to go out and to take the paper off the front walk and to go ahead and sit down with the paper. He said that's just not the way a person spends Shabbos. That will say again. That's an opinion. He's quoted the halacha before. That's an opinion afterwards. And I will say, in the last piece, he brings up Yanki's piece. V'imanochri hevi es ha'iton liyehudi derech makom she'en bo erev vaslo taltal sham Ein kol heter likra gam b'Shabbos. Shabbos saying the discussion of reading your newspaper that's delivered on Shabbos is really a non-starter. Why? Because the paper is almost always brought from outside of the tchum, right? And it's certainly brought from a place where there's no eruv, which means that the Nachri did a malacha in order to bring it to me. So, I'm sorry? And there's carrying. He's talking about eruv over here. Eruv tchumen. Eruv tchumen. Right? Outside of the tchum. Right, outside of the tchum. So the assumption always is that the paper is coming from outside of the tchum, and therefore, again, a malacha was done ultimately, again, for the sake of the Jew. It's just it could be erev chatzeres or erev tchum. It doesn't really matter. Either way, what it's saying is the paper got to me in a way that I could not have gotten it myself. Therefore, a malacha was done to get me that paper on Shabbos. And then again, you see a both say, but you'll say, one second, you just said I can read the paper, even though it's right, it's printed for me also. It's not printed for me. Who is it printed for? The majority of its reader base, which is not Jewish. But when the guy delivers it to my doorstep, I can't exactly hide behind the majority Gentile reader base. Why not? Because there's only one person who lives at my address, hopefully, and that's me. And that's me, which means the delivery of it was done for me. So therefore, I will say what turns out over here is quite fascinating, that although there may be many heterim to actually read the paper on Shabbos, many heterim, even Rav Shlomo Zalman said on Shabbos, you can read the paper, Shvus Yaakov, Shelas Yavis, you can, Magen Avram, there's plenty, but to read the paper which was delivered on Shabbos, that you can't do, because you have to make the assumption that that paper came from outside of the Eruv, a malacha was done in order to get it to you, and therefore you are not permitted to read it on Shabbos. So if you want to save Friday's paper, not read it on Friday, and save that oneg for Shabbos, it appears that one would be permitted to do so. But to take the paper that was delivered Shabbos morning and read it, Rav Shlomo Zalman says the problem, it's usher, but we'll say incredible, not usher als reading a newspaper, but rather again usher als the fact that the Nachri did a malacha for me on Shabbos.
It's delivered to my friend. It's delivered to my friend, and I see it there, and I read it.
No, because you can't be nana from a malacha done for another Jew either.
If it's a guy is in your tongue.
I'm sorry?
He's bringing it for the guy, and he's also bringing it for you.
You're saying you're by your friend who's a guy.
In your tongue. If you have a guy in your tongue,
Yeah.
say,
No, but Lamaisa, but there's still that Maisa.
bringing it for the guy also.
Yaakov, you're assuming it's the same Maisa. It's not the same Maisa. Because the act of him...
Into the tongue. Let's see if 20
But
guys.
the act of him taking a paper for me and delivering it to my home is, I think, or Shlomo Zalman, it's a
That's assuming he's the only.
Yeah, I hear, but Rav Shlomo Zalman clearly doesn't feel that way. His understand. I'll give you the raya. The raya is what happens when you go away. Can you stop delivery to your house?
Yes.
No.
Yes, you can. What kind of paper?
He brings it every week, I'd say.
No. But I'm saying you could stop delivery to your house.
It's mashma either way. It's usher. It really should be mashma anyway, so it's a moot point.
No. When he says Ra'i L'Yirei Shamayim, that's a hashkafic statement. So we're going to divide this. Again, that's what I mentioned before. The hashkafa, whether or not you should read a newspaper on Shabbos, that's a different discussion. We're talking about from the halachic perspective, he's making a distinction between something that is delivered to your house, same way you could cancel it, right? If you cancel it, the whole block doesn't lose it. Only you cancel it for you, which means a specialized service of delivery is being given to you. Varaya, but what's the proof? The proof is there's a different price for the newspaper when you go into 7-Eleven and pick it up than when you go and you have it delivered to your house. What are you paying for? You're paying for delivery. You're paying for a service. So something specific is being done for you, can't be nana from that malacha.
If somebody's in a hotel for Shabbos and there are Eden and
Oh.
so the U.S. news that comes to my
Correct.
door, I can't read, but the one downstairs in the lobby.
Correct. We'll say good. I think Yank is a good point. If you're in a hotel for Shabbos, right. So if they have papers out by the lobby, I mean, you might get into an Erev Chatzeros issue, but yeah. All right. Correct. That would be permitted. If it's Rov Nachum in the hotel. Right. If you're singing a Jewish program, that might be a problem. All right, Chavrei, Shkayach, everyone.
The best place, Kalahari is probably going to know.
Yeah, sure.
Read the journal, no problem.
I don't even know what it is, by the way.
It's a hotel and a water park.